Good afternoon, everyone. It's Dr. Gershon with another Endeavor Better Health webinar series. I am really thrilled to have Dr. Kaveh Safavi here today because he is really an insightful industry leader who's going to bring to us very salient, of the moment, relevant pieces of information to put a roadmap together. And this roadmap is important for entrepreneur founders and CEOs of both emerging companies as well as new unicorns, for them to understand that there is a real demand side push to be able to integrate their technologies into Fortune 500 companies, but that there are parameters within that journey that CEO entrepreneur founders need to understand to make their integration effective. So first, I would really like to thank everybody for their support in this incredible year of Endeavor Better Health. We now have 1.45 million views. We're growing with partnerships with Biospace. And I think it really is a testament to the validity of what we've been driving throughout the whole year, which is sharing information in an open source platform that promotes partnering, networking, and collaboration. So thank you everyone for being so incredibly supportive of this journey. Now I'm going to just flip this over to Kaveh, and I just want to briefly introduce him because he really is a person with incredible practical skills. He is a physician and attorney, but more than that, he is a business leader. He understands really what Fortune 500 companies want. He has seen over the many years real inside demand in terms of integrating new innovation and technologies into large corporations. What does industry need? How can industry take advantage of new innovations? And what is it that is success and what is unfortunately the case studies for failure for the integration of some of these incredible new technologies? Mm-hmm. So I'd like to introduce you to Kaveh. Kaveh, please welcome. It is a real honor to have you on here. We've had incredible conversations over the past few months that have really just, I think, highlighted the fact that there is need for somebody like yourself to be able to talk to this audience. The audience really is a mix between large industry investors and entrepreneur CEO founders. And so first, perhaps you can give us a very short blurb on your background.
Sure.
Then I think we're going to focus in on AI and Gen AI as the two core technologies that you have extensive experience with, and a roadmap about integrating those into enterprises.
Absolutely. So Kaveh Safavi, Martin, nice to be with you again. I'm one of the global leaders at Accenture. I serve our clients that include delivery system, insurance, and governments. I started my life as a physician, internal medicine, pediatrics doctor, practiced medicine, went to law school, started a business that ran medical practices. That business got acquired. So I moved from the bedside care into actually an insurance company, which acquired us. I've had operating roles both in the payment side as well as the delivery side. And then the last 20 years, I was in an global analytics business, an infrastructure business, and I've been at Accenture for about 12 years. I've worked inside and outside the United States for about 15 years. I've probably worked in 20 countries. And my primary interest and passion right now is trying to ask the question, how do we intersect technology and human capacity, human ingenuity together to solve problems that can't be solved any other way?
Fantastic overview. And I think it points to the first question, which is, you have tremendous exposure to large clients who are Fortune 500 companies. They have a core IT infrastructure. They are looking at some of the new technologies in AI. Can you give us some examples in the healthcare space about how the need and the demand side of that equation translates into actionable events? Now, this is an important distinguishing point between the hype that we see in AI and in Gen AI, which is these technologies have the capability of solving every problem. And that might be a little overstated, but that's the vibe, as opposed to the real life time course and the integration to solve problems in industry and in enterprises.
Yeah. Well, I'd say, we've talked about AI for a good solid decade with a lot of optimism. The conversation has really been energized in the last year because generative AI as a type of artificial intelligence has captured our imagination in a particular way. But if you go back and look at least within the healthcare industry, what was foundationally the reason why we thought artificial intelligence was going to be meaningful. It was largely because we thought it was going to bring us better insights and allow us to make better decisions. Those decisions could flow through better products. It could flow through better health outcomes. It could flow through having our people perform to a better level. If you're thinking about it through the lens of people doing work, it could flow through understanding your operating costs better and running your business more economically efficiently. But for the most part, it was really technologies that gave us better judgment-based insights that would ultimately have to be acted on by human beings in some fashion. Part of what, and the challenge is that you add this on top of people who are already doing their job, and you have to ask the question, how much better can I get? And is it worth getting to it? And getting to it has all kinds of foundational issues around everything from the literal cost, technology cost, foundational cost, all the way to people changing the way they do things in order to take advantage of it. And we had some AI found its way into some things. There were some fit for purpose clinical decision technologies and workflow technologies that had a little bit of AI in it. We started to get a little bit better at technologies that could read documents with traditional artificial intelligence. But I think why the conversation has become really interesting in the last year is because generative AI as a type of AI was able to address one specific thing, which is language, which in healthcare is a major component of people's time. And what we are facing in healthcare, probably as much or worse than any other industry, is the impact of the shortage of expertise to provide services for patients. So demand for care growing because of aging population. At the same time, the number of people in the workforce, just to put a precise number on it globally, 50% more people will be in the cohort over the age of 60 in the next decade. That's important because they consume healthcare resources 3 to 5 times as much as people under the age of 60. At the same time, the number of people working to support people over the age of 60 or under 18 goes down by 25%. So we have a non-linear increase in demand compared to the availability of people to do the work. And so society, particularly rich countries, but every country, is starting to see access to healthcare as the issue that needs to be addressed. If you have to get into the delivery system, there's no people there to do the work. And it's very exaggerated if you go to like the UK, where right now in the NHS, if you want an elective procedure, the average waiting time is 18 months. In Ireland, it's 24 months. In many countries and even in the United States, people with good insurance in urban areas for certain elective procedures have seen a doubling in their waiting time, largely driven by the lack of people available, nurses, doctors. That problem just gets worse, and that becomes the fundamental quality issue. Then we ask the question, well, how are we going to scale human labor? And what we recognize is that the tasks of reading and writing can consume 25 to 50% of somebody's time. And now I have a technology that can take some of those tasks over. So oftentimes when we think about technology and people working together, we ask the question, is the technology going to augment human capacity, or is it going to automate? Automate means takes tasks over, not jobs, but takes tasks over. Most artificial intelligence until now had an augmenting role. So person still has to do the work, but they do a better job. the language models and generative AI take over reading and writing tasks. And we now have an ability to start automating, not just augmenting, giving people time back to do things only people can do. And that particular observation is central to our path out of the supply-demand mismatch that we have in healthcare. So I think much of the enthusiasm is driven not just because it's interesting, but because it's become important, because we've literally run out of people to do the work and we don't have any other answers. We can't hire them, train them, or steal them and enough to make a difference. And we're going to actually have to rethink the way work is done. So I think that's really what's happening.
This is such a great starting point. Once again, your ability to take a big picture and then focus it in on really action items. So the action items here are driven by the demand. The demand is, resource shortages, both in terms of manpower and frankly, in a macroeconomic environment of illiquidity, which we expect at Endeavor from our research to last 10 to 14 years.
Mm-hmm.
So the cost of healthcare, the ability to finance healthcare, and the ability to supply human resources is now constrained. One of the critical applications, and I think you pointed this out, which is a stepwise change in addressing this problem, is the ability to increase productivity in an automated environment. To me, this is outstanding. And one of the things I like to do here is talk about some real life case studies. So I am going to talk about Microsoft and Nuance. So a lot of what they're focused in on is physician, nurse, and other healthcare providers who have to use the computer, step away from the patient, interact with the computer, jot notes while talking to the patient, gathering data, blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, pulse ox, etc., incorporating diagnostics, and all of this can potentially be automated. What I would like to know from you is, in this environment, can you talk about some of the use cases surrounding this one specific section, which is electronic healthcare records, and the ability for young companies to recognize that it's important for them to take their technology, identify pain points that Microsoft and others may have in their long-term plan to improve electronic healthcare records, and then formulate an understanding of how do you incorporate your innovation in a business-like fashion to help large organizations like Microsoft. So that's a series of questions, opening it up to your thoughts.
Well, so we think about this all the time. It's become probably the most inspiring example of generative AI taking over human tasks. Quantitatively, it's not having it's going to take a while, but because there are other things that are happening with generative AI, but from an inspiration and a signaling, it's probably the most critical. I think we need to step back for 1 second and ask the question, how did we get into the situation we're in right now? And the answer is actually pretty straightforward if you think about what's happened in healthcare in the last 2 to 3 decades. You go back to the late 90s, and the zeitgeist for healthcare was that it was unsafe because of errors. The Institute of Medicine to Err is Human, equivalent of a jumbo jet going down every day, that inspired public and private sector to react. And we reacted by saying, oh my God, we have so much process variation, and all kinds of approaches were built to solve process variation. And then we said, well, we got to hardwire process variation. And so general purpose information technology is a perfect way to hardwire processes and take the process variation out. Things like decision support, et cetera. Great. Information technology, though, can only act if it has structured data to act on. And so the electronic health records emerged from the first version of electronic records, which is nothing more than a digital paper document repository, which is still present in many parts of the world. It's nothing more than a transcription and the only role is to make it easier for a doctor to get their eyes on what another doctor wrote. So instead of moving paper, I move a digital piece of paper, but there's no structured data, there's no analytics, there's nothing that's coming off of it. That was not going to make our healthcare system safer. We knew that. We needed structured data. So why doctors type is to capture structured data concepts that can be used for analytics, for decision support, for workflow. Otherwise, we would have been perfectly fine just dumping a bunch of transcripts into an electronic file cabinet and moving them around. As we made gains, it came at a price, and the price was labor productivity. A physician loses about 10 to 15% of their productivity because of interacting with a keyboard. The data has actually been published in the US. If you look at healthcare labor productivity in the period from 2000 to 2020, there was a 13% loss in human productivity due to information technology. Care got safer, better decisions, but it came at the price of human productivity. But we had enough people, so we didn't care about it. Now we got to figure out how to give them their time back. Okay. There are two things that happen when a doctor interacts with a keyboard, and it's important to understand that. It's not just capturing the concepts, because that can be done narratively through transcription. It's also capturing the structured data concepts. And why that's important is because generative AI language models actually have the ability to do both. So if you think about what's happening right now with the Microsoft Nuance product that's being used primarily in physician offices, one doctor, one patient, non-hospital setting, relatively controlled. It's able to listen to the conversation between a doctor and a patient. Because it's generative in its nature, it listens to the whole session and it makes sense of what happened. And then it recharacterizes that conversation into a note the way a doctor would have done it had the doctor taken the time to actually stop and recharacterize the note. So it knows, for example, that something that was said at minute 19 actually relates to something that was said at minute 2. So when I describe the subjective in a SOAP note, for example, it's going to bring both of those together. That's different than transcription. Transcription would have just been a literal chronologic narrative of what was said, and someone would have to have made sense of it and organized it. But it also has the ability to understand a structured concept and extract that, taking away the need to force somebody to type anything in to capture a structured concept. So we now get the benefit of both the cognitive representation of what the doctor thinks is the, in the visit, and the structured concepts. There is one interesting reality, though, which is what I just described to you only works if the doctor works out loud and they think out loud. Because it doesn't have any idea what the diagnosis or the treatment is. It is not substituting any judgment. It's not listening to a conversation and then deciding the diagnosis. If the doctor doesn't signal it verbally, nothing appears in the record to indicate it. So this is not a judgment tool. This is not a diagnosis tool. It has nothing to do with any of that. It does require people to change the way they work. And what we're seeing when we bring language tools into any kind of work environment, healthcare or non-healthcare, is that the humans interact differently with the technology to gain the benefit of it. Specifically in healthcare, where we want to take over documentation burdens from doctors or nurses, they're going to have to learn to work out loud instead of working in silence. And they're also going to have to be explicit in the room with the patient about what they're thinking, which, I would argue the academic data suggests that's probably a good thing, but the anecdotal and mythological perception is that that's a bad thing in some cases. And after all, I trained at an academic medical center. Attendings and fellows and residents always talked out loud in front of the patient because that's how we learned. It's only when we left training that suddenly we thought, oh, wow, we're not going to talk out loud, or we're not going to narrate the exam, or we're not going to tell you what we're really thinking because that might upset you. So it's not really alien. It's how we train doctors, but it's not how doctors practice in normal life.
Yeah, it's such an incredibly important point that you brought up, and it's not talked about enough, which is the education that is important as part of this transition to digitalized healthcare. The component that is really, I think, going to create sustainable depth from any AI integration is the next generation healthcare providers. And so being able to bring a mindset to this is important. I, like you, was trained in an academic center with the Osler techniques, the methodology, which is really about getting a good history, doing a good physical,
Right.
really understanding the patient from a human perspective as well as a physiologic perspective. I see one component of the AI technology as just being a tremendous resource to allow more time for that human interaction to
Mhm.
happen. And so when we talk about the ability for some of the technologies to be able to integrate into large ecosystems and the ability for them to provide productivity and value to the patient, one of the critical things in this process is going to be to free up the physician time.
Mhm.
In this process, now it's up to the educational system to be able to augment the training to be a better listener, a better communicator, a person who has the ability to have greater sense of empathy. I actually teach a course at Columbia University for pre-med students, which looks at many of these issues and poses the question to these physicians and healthcare workers to be, mostly physicians in this class,
Mhm.
what kind of doctor do you want to be? And so I think that within this integration of technology into the healthcare system, we now have a very interesting opportunity to be able to use the time that we free up in a number of different ways. It could be to see more patients, it could be to have higher quality time per patient. And there is an expression in athletics, particularly in skiing, which I think is somewhat applicable here. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast.
Mhm.
So, really, the notion is you can run through things and you can do a superficial history and you can miss things. Or you could take your time feeling less pressured, be methodical, and be smooth in your approach to understanding what the problems are and the potential solutions, not just from a pure scientific medical standpoint, but also, that important emotional standpoint.
Mhm.
Sometimes some of the things that we do as physicians are correct, but they don't necessarily produce the results that we want because one of the key things that's embedded in whatever the interaction is between physician and patient is the patient compliance aspect.
Mhm.
So if we prescribe a medication and the patient can't get that medication, or if we ask the patient to get a diagnostic test and the patient has some family issues or personal issues or job issues that they can't access that particular diagnostic test, these are things that we really, as healthcare providers, need to understand. And we just don't have the time because the resource problem, as you said, is so pressing. So I would love for you to perhaps expand a little bit about what you see as next generation coming from this Gen AI integration
Mhm.
and this ability to impact the patient.
Yeah.
What you see in your crystal ball.
Well, I'm going to go back to the framework of the interaction of technology and people through the lens of does it automate or does it augment? And both of them have benefits. So if we go to the automate frame, for example, that's really where you start thinking about taking tasks away from clinicians and giving them time back. And when you give someone time back, use technology to give them time back or change their work to give them time back, you generally see it follow two archetypes. Usually the first units of time are reclaimed by the individual to make their lives better in some fashion. You gave the example of a doctor to think more deeply, to maybe take a rest and clear their mind. Maybe it's to have a longer conversation with the patient. But that's what that, and then after they get larger units of time, they go from reclaim to repurpose, and maybe they can see additional patients. But the technology for sure gives time back. And when it does, that time can be reused in some fashion. The other way to think about it is the augmentation role, which is what does it do that still is being done by a doctor, but fundamentally makes them more impactful. And you touched, for example, on empathy, and there's people have observed the fact that the language models are so compelling in their narrative that they often communicate in a more empathetic way than a human does. And this was published in the popular press because the research paper that showed that a generative AI-based conversation was judged by patients to be more empathetic than the doctor conversation. And I laugh a little when I hear that because I'm not sure if that speaks highly of the technology or speaks poorly of the doctor. But the truth of the matter is these language models are incredibly effective. That's one of the reasons why they're being used right now by creative people as first draft content creation. So content creation for content creators, because it's incredible at that. And why that's important is because that gives physicians the ability to have a potentially more persuasive interaction with their patient. And oftentimes that's the difference between the patient being able to understand and take care of themselves in a better way, is the ability to do that. Now, it didn't give the doctor any time back, but it does measurably affect things like outcomes. And maybe it doesn't even measurably affect outcomes, but it might measurably affect the patient's perception of the value of that relationship. Martin, you and I both know doctors who treat patients for which no treatment exists. And I, as a doctor, have vivid memories of some of my most grateful patients were patients that died of a condition for which no treatment existed. And it made me realize very early on that a patient isn't grateful solely because you treat a condition. In many cases, that's not realistic. And what they're grateful for is your ability to go with them on the journey, be present, be empathetic. So there's a lot to be said for that. So I think that we're going to see both of those things play themselves out. The last observation I want to make when you think about this interaction of people and technology, particularly artificial intelligence technology, is that what we're increasingly going to discover is that our technology partner is actually going to be really good at finding answers. And the role of the human in the human machine dyad that does the work is going to pivot from having answers to asking questions. In fact, in generative AI, that is effectively what prompting a generative AI engine is. It's basically is pushing back and asking it to come back with a different answer or address a different question. And the premium on humans and human machine combinations is getting questions right, because the machine will get the answer if I can get the question right.
Yeah, these are such fantastic points. I want to transition over. I think I've lost my video here. I don't know if you can see me.
I can't see you. No.
Yeah. But we still have audio. So I want to kind of press on. I think what I'm really interested in is the roadmap to success. So the roadmap to success is this ability now to continue to work with technologies that we've been working with for more than 10 years. And it is now a pivot point, a transition point within the healthcare system to digitalize. The question is, how are we going to do that? And how are we going to operationalize this large scale integration? And you've been involved with this large scale rollout component. What I want to understand more is the process of partnering, collaborating, working together to give confidence, which I think is a big part of the integration story, to large enterprise decision makers. What I see on the pharma side in particular is a history that's somewhat spotted, a history of integration, of collaboration, of acquisition, which not infrequently ends in a 2 or 3 year program that is shelved. And this process speaks to the complexity of integrating new technologies into large ecosystems. So, one of the things that I do as the senior executive investor in residence at Techstars, as a managing partner at Endeavor, is to be able to advise young CEO entrepreneur founders about how do you take your technology in a practical sense and enroll large industry leaders in your vision. So I'd like you to speak a little bit about this relatively slow moving process. Do you see a way forward to make this integration process accelerate? Do you see it in a light where there is a higher demand, a greater catalyst from the industry side that will allow more sustained partnerships? And what can the young entrepreneur, founder, CEO do to be able to generate an authentic story that resonates with these decision makers?
If you think about it through the lens of big companies right now, I'm seeing three kinds of things happen, three basic starting points. They often coexist, but sometimes they go in a sequence. Thing one is historically been, do I have my fundamental foundational technology in place? And because artificial intelligence by its nature is fundamentally compute intense, you really cannot engage in using the technologies of AI and Gen AI if you don't have a solid foundation for things like public cloud, because all these things run on public cloud. The data has to go to public cloud. You've got to figure out how to do that. In healthcare, which is somewhat lagged the rest of the society in terms of public cloud adoption, is going to not be able to absorb the technologies that are being developed because they haven't gotten the foundation right. So there is a whole foundational technology investment that's occurring in organizations who have been inspired and say, look, the business outcomes that are out there, I'll never get to without these new technologies. Now I got to get this right. So that's thing one. Thing two is fundamentally a framework for responsible artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has really caused organizations to think hard about technology through the lens of governance, everything from your theories around data bias and data ownership to privacy issues, intellectual property issues. And we're seeing organizations now actually recognizing that they need to have a responsible AI framework and policies in place well ahead of any technologies that show up. Now, why is that important? Because if I'm a company selling them a tech that has AI in it, it is very likely that I'm going to be faced with a contract that has very specific requirements that have been influenced by guidance that's coming from US, maybe Europe. And if I haven't thought about that, I have no contract. Never going to happen. So you need to recognize that all the issues of responsible AI are going to be in the minds of your customers, even if that's the very first thing they do. Then the third one, which we're starting to see organizations gain a level of sophistication, is recognizing that the business case for the technology doesn't occur until after the work or the job changes. I have many examples of incredibly interesting young digital companies that have a interesting piece of artificial intelligence in them that get essentially fishing licenses or hunting licenses, meaning they have a license with a client but no utilization. And the reason they have no utilization is because the business case requires the non-technology part of the house to care, to use, and to change the way they work, or no benefits get accrued. I have personally been involved in conversations where the CFO and the CIO want to bring an idea forward. They ask me what I think, and I tell them I wouldn't take a step forward because the right people are not in this room. So you go get in this case, it was clinical people in the room committed to the adoption. You're wasting your time. It doesn't matter how cool the tech is. So this idea of recognizing that the jobs change, and that's the business runner's problem, and it's not IT and it's not the vendor's problem, is pretty critical. Otherwise, vendors are going to get, technology companies are going to discover that they have a good news, bad news situation, which is a client is perfectly willing to do business with them, but won't use it at all until that other problem gets solved, and it's not in their remit. So I think all three of these things matter. And I think if you're a company building really interesting tech, you've got to understand what their theory is around foundational technology and who their partners are, what their theory is around responsible AI and what you need to be prepared to deal with contractually, and what it takes to actually get adoption, because you won't get consumption without adoption.
Oh, these are such absolutely terrific and practical points. It goes to the issue of really the skill sets that the CEO entrepreneur founders have now are broader than they were in the past 20 years. it's important that they understand the inner workings of large organizations and the complexity of that decision-making process. As you pointed out, there are several different parameters around the ability to bring technology into large organizations. I mean, just the ability to allocate financial resources, human resources, go through some of the logistical issues that you just pointed out. These are important when you come to the table to negotiate. And these are skill sets that we think at Endeavor and in Techstars are quite important for the successful transition of technology into large enterprises. One of the, I think, key things that everybody looks for is the ability for people to work with others in an easy way. And that ease of working relationships goes to a central point, which is understanding, or frankly, being empathetic to the other person's needs, pain points, problems. So it's very important, I think, both from the industry perspective and from the entrepreneur perspective, to understand that what the things that we're doing right now are going to have long-term implications for patients, for society at large. Our focus really at Endeavor is about commercialization. We consider our KPI the number of companies that produce commercially viable products. We leave the decision making as to the worth of those particular products or services up to patients, doctors, healthcare providers, other decision makers. Obviously, we have confidence in the companies that we're backing at Techstars, at Endeavor, and in other accelerators that I work with. But I think the key thing is that there's opportunity here for creative integration into healthcare. And who's to say, who has kind of, the crystal ball to say which of these technologies is going to be the best,
Right.
which is not going to really work? You can only say that in hindsight. So for us, the benchmark that we look for is leaders who understand that they need to be resilient, adapt, pivot, understand how to build teams that drive successful projects, so that industry leaders have confidence that when these CEOs come to them and they say, hey, I can do this, industry actually believes that they have a team that can execute. So I would love to finish off this conversation by talking a little bit about, if you had a magic wand as a physician now, and you're wearing your white coat, and you're seeing this incredible turnout of technologies across big tech, who's invested $100 billion over the past few years in Microsoft, Google, Apple, Amazon, NVIDIA. Where would you put that emphasis? What part of the healthcare system needs this technology the most?
Yeah.
And I'll just give you a few different corridors that we play in and then leave it up to you. So the corridor that we've been talking about is this productivity corridor, human resource corridor. But I would also point out, on the technology side, there is medical device technology now that is improving predictive value, endoscopy, for imaging, for pathology. There is another area which is improving the ability to create novel new products, such as finding new drug targets that without AI, human beings couldn't find. Increase the productivity of that and the speed to market, but also increase the ability to find brand new ideas. So I'd love to hear, which corridor do you think has the most, let's say, bang for the buck in 10 years?
So I think that the next decade is going to be marked predominantly by an access problem globally because of the labor shortage. So, if you think about healthcare through the lens of access, affordability, and effectiveness, the last decade or two, we've been a balance between affordability and effectiveness. So the technologies that made healthcare better or made healthcare more affordable got a lot of attention. I think right now we're seeing access starting to replace that because of the labor shortage, and access becomes a bigger quality problem when you don't have anyone to see. It doesn't matter if they're making a good decision. So my instincts are that technologies that make access work are not going to get used or are going to be problematic, and technologies that make access better are going to get promoted. So if you're building a business and you think about that and you say, look, mine is effectiveness, that's really what I'm about, just ask the question, what is the knock-on effect on access? Because if the access problem is worse, it doesn't matter that it's more effective. If it's better, you might actually be able to have a different business case because you're going to actually be able to affect both. But that's really what I think the next decade is driven by, is this access issue.
That's such a great, insightful message. At the end of the day, it's all about the patient. It's the patient user experience. It's the patient outcomes. And so I think, certainly the notion that there are different healthcare models with different problems across the globe is something that we don't pay enough attention to here in the United States. You have a global picture.
Mm-hmm.
You see the difficulties that are really, front and center in many countries. And here we have our own access issues,
Mm-hmm.
economic constraints, travel constraints, technology constraints on a geographic basis, across the board. And then certainly the human resource presents, probably the most important constraint to access.
Mm-hmm.
In the mental health space, which has been just an incredibly underserved community for decades, COVID has brought the problem front and center.
Right.
In order for patients now to see a qualified healthcare provider in the mental health area, it could be a 6-month wait.
Absolutely.
And so I think the things that you're focusing in on are really what I would call in the trenches. That is to say that you see things from a doctor perspective and you see things from a business perspective. And that information I want to leave as a take-home message to everyone viewing here, which is that it's so critically important to be practical in your application of your technology. And that practical component only comes from speaking to people like Kaveh and others who have this unique blend of medicine, science, and business. And I would urge every young entrepreneur, frankly, to reach out to people who have this unique mix. This is the way of the future. Collaboration, partnership, sharing and exchanging in an iterative fashion. What are the problems? Finding those solutions. To me, it's never been a more exciting time.
Thanks, Martin. It was really a pleasure to be here with you.
Kaveh, it's been absolutely fantastic. I'm sorry I lost my camera there. I'm going to have to trade in my Mac for a next generation Mac. But I really look forward to a follow-up, perhaps in 6 months. We have some exciting new conferences that are going to be spearheading conversations in this area in January at JP Morgan, which I'll be attending. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in to this really dynamic and unique conversation, because we've never had somebody on the webinar before with this mix of business and science background, like we've had today. So thank you so much, Kaveh. Stay on for just a minute. I'm just going to end the recording here. And